All right, thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be doing a panel discussion on designing an environmental monitoring program that exceeds USP 797. So my name is Abby Roth. I'm the Senior Director of Business Operations for Critical Point. I'll be doing the moderation here, and let's have the panelists introduce themselves. So Matt, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Martin. I currently serve as the Manager of Clinical Services at Professional Compounding Centers of America.
All right, Tennille?
Hi guys, I'm Tennille Davis. I'm the pharmacist in charge at Civic Center Pharmacy, a sterile and non-sterile compounding pharmacy in Scottsdale, Arizona. And I'm also a board certified sterile compounding pharmacist.
Thanks, Tennille. All right, and last but not least, we have Kim.
Hi, my name is Kim Kiefer, and I am currently the Director of Quality Assurance for Anazao Health in Las Vegas, which is a registered 503B.
All right, great. So we'll start off by asking some questions, and hopefully we'll have some really good discussion here. So let's start off kind of with the probably biggest thing on our minds right now is looking at what are the main differences relating to viable sampling, or EM, between the 2008, 2019, and now the proposed 2021 versions of USP 797.
Yeah, so we've got the new version of 797 out, as you mentioned. I think it's safe to say the current version, the 2008 version of 797, had a fairly limited amount of environmental monitoring with its viable air sampling every 6 months, and it just described periodic surface sampling, so not exactly a defined timeline for that. So in the 2019 version, that viable air sampling was still every 6 months, and the surface sampling had gone to monthly. But we've had some changes. The most recent iteration of 797 breaks it down based on the category of the sterile compounds. We don't have the low, medium risk, high risk categories that we've had in the past. We've gone to category 1, 2, and now category 3 sterile compounds. And so for category 1 and 2, this is going to remain every 6 months for viable air sampling. But if you are doing category 3, those sterile compounds with the extended BUDs, you are going to be looking at monthly viable air sampling. As in regards to surface sampling, the 2019 version of 797 did move that to monthly, and that's still the case for category 1 and 2 CSPs, but in the case of the category 3 with the extended BUDs, they are moving to weekly surface sampling. So we've definitely seen a shift in their thinking, and for those things with longer BUDs, there's an increase in the amount of environmental monitoring that 797 is pushing for.
Yeah. Okay, along kind of the same lines there, because we know that there were some changes to the identification of microorganisms. So how do you see the removal of identifying every microorganism recovered affect the microbial state of control of your sterile compounding pharmacy?
So they removed the requirement to identify down to the genus level microorganisms recovered via surface sampling or air sampling unless action limits were exceeded. And this makes a lot of sense in places like the anteroom, because sending those samples out for identification is time consuming and expensive. And oftentimes, you're going to get the same growth over and over again. But growth in the PEC is troublesome. So I'm a little bit worried that removing that requirement is going to reduce pharmacies' frequency of sending those samples in for identification in the PEC, where even if it doesn't exceed action limits, so if they only grow 1 CFU, it could potentially be one of those microorganisms that's highly pathogenic to humans.
I think another concern with not identifying as frequently is that you miss an opportunity to understand where these organisms are coming from. And if you have something potentially new in your environment, I think also trending what's in the ante room is actually pretty important, because that's sort of your last stop on the bus before it really gets into your more controlled space. So removing that requirement will also remove opportunities to understand that if it's a technician or operator issue, if it's something that's being tracked in from the outside environment. So I think that is fairly problematic.
So thinking about that, then what would you potentially recommend to compounding organizations to kind of still meet the chapter, but maybe do a little bit more from an identification standpoint? Do you have any thoughts on how, you might either handle this in your own organization or what you would recommend to others?
I think we can all agree on identifying anything that grows in the ISO 5. I don't think we're going to find too much disagreement in this group of folks.
No.
And then I think beyond that, I think keeping a record of what has grown and maybe keeping pictures of the growth that you've had, and certainly anything that's new that you've never seen before. I definitely want to identify that. I've seen a few instances where people discovered things either about the facility, the other businesses that they were connected to in the same building, and there being unknown connections in the ventilation systems between businesses, leading to unexpected growth of organisms in their compounding environments, or people that got new pets and maybe brought some of that with them on their person when they came to work. And so when we start seeing these new items growing, I think we definitely need to get more information to know what they are.
Okay. So how about we kind of shift gears here a little bit? And can you discuss some of the FDA's expectations when it comes to environmental monitoring program, and then why it's important for 503A pharmacies to kind of be aware of some of these expectations?
So the FDA is chiefly concerned with control in your environment. And what USP 797 has offered us is actually, if you read through it, even the current older chapter, it paints a pretty nice narrative of what you should do. I think the only thing that it doesn't do is have more specific requirements. But having a better idea of what's happening in your environment and trends to track will give you a better understanding of the state of control that you're in. And that's really what FDA is looking for, is your state of control, because for them, the end product that's going to your patient is the most important thing. And if you really don't know what's going on in there, then it puts everything that you're doing at risk. So if we are going to be monitoring twice a year and you have a sterility failure, like 3 months after your last clean room certification, well, do you need to recall everything you've done since then? You have no data points to look back at. And that is the chief concern, of the agency. So there are a lot of documents out there in the world that can help with that. I think the best one for all of us 797 people is 1116, which is an informational chapter from USP that is, by the way, referenced 14 times in the current USP chapter. And I don't know, I bet you Matt knows how many times it's referenced in the new chapter, but it's more. And there's a lot of good information in there, and that information more mimics what we would see in a GMP environment in terms of microbiological control. So I think being familiar with that chapter can be very, very useful. And it's there being referenced because they want you to look at it and be more familiar with it and understand that there is more things you can do. When they say at least, that's an opportunity to discover more. And I think when you start to look more and search more, it will give you a much better picture of really what's happening in there and what could potentially go wrong, and what could potentially get into your final products. And of course, none of us want any of that to occur, but it really is a state of constant vigilance. There are other documents. There is an aseptic manufacturing guidance for industry that FDA offers for industry, so not specifically for compounding, but industry. And again, it's going to look a lot like your 1116. And then there's also 503B guidance, which is sort of their CGMP guidance for 503Bs, which looks a lot like 21 CFR. However, there are some specific allowances in there because they understand that we are still compounding in that environment as well. But all of those things can help. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to do all of those, but it will give you a little bit more guidance. And there are other references if anybody else wants to like talk about their favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I think as a 503A pharmacy, it's really important to be familiar with the 503B GMP guidance, just because it's a way for you to look at what you could do that's above and beyond the minimum requirements. And 797 is the minimum requirement that we're required to adhere to. We can always do more testing, more monitoring of our products to ensure integrity of our sterile compounded products.
Yeah, I think there's always kind of the rub for compounders when they first get into understanding how FDA works, because a lot of folks are very used to USP and USP being fairly prescriptive in saying do this, and that's what meets the standard. And I don't really think that's FDA's approach. I mean, I'm certainly not going to speak for the agency by any means, but their approach is more about you bringing whatever is deemed a sufficient amount of data to prove that you have that state of control, to prove that your system is robust enough to provide that feedback to prevent catastrophic things from happening. And so that is more the mindset, I think, that if people want to have a better understanding and appreciation for how FDA approaches it, they're not going to tell you you're going to do this or do this many times, but it's come with enough data that they can be fairly comfortable that when sterile products are produced in your facility, that the likelihood of contamination is very low. And it's about that quantity of data that you can provide that helps them get to that point, along with other factors. But I think it's a shift in mindset from looking for maybe so much as a list to check off to more so trying to build, what would be considered a robust or sufficient amount of data.
Yeah, it's all part of this GMP sort of understanding of building quality into your process. So, we cannot rely on finished product testing because those sterility tests are fairly insensitive. You can't test every single unit, so you're just getting a representative test. But we know that there can be contamination in any vector of your final product. So the only way to really have assurances is to have, like Matt was saying, enough data that makes everyone reasonably comfortable that you know what's going on in your environment and your product is going to be sterile.
Right. And one of the other things that kind of goes along with that point, Kim, is that you working in a 503B organization, sterility testing is a normal thing for you. On the other side, depending on what's being compounded in the 503A, sterility testing isn't even there for that assurance. So your point of building that quality into the process really does become important for the 503A compounder for sure. So all really great points.
Probably more
that.
So.
Yeah. So we mentioned USP 1116. We talked a little bit about the 503B guidance. Are there any other documents or places that you would suggest, other organizations that maybe people could look into or check out for additional information that they could use in building their programs?
Sure, we can look beyond the U.S. if we want to. We can go so far as to go to Europe and start looking at documents like Annex 1. I think, previously we've discussed the value of potentially joining groups like the Parenteral Drug Association or PDA, and they certainly have some excellent resources there as well. So there are a number of great places to go out and find more information. FDA has an older aseptic processing guidance document that's out there and freely available as well, and kind of gives you a greater vision of their thoughts.
Great. So working with some of the clients that we work with in our organization, sterile compounding pharmacies kind of tend to struggle with developing a really robust EM program because they're pharmacists and don't really have kind of that background in microbiology. So, we did talk about some sampling frequency here, and we started, to talk a little bit about what the chapter requires, but can we go into a little bit more on the benefits of what we get out of sampling more frequently than what the chapter requires?
I'll jump in. I'll take a shot at it. Y'all let me know. But I think the increase in the environmental monitoring gives us a few different things. More data gives a greater picture to what we're doing, a greater understanding to whether we have a state of control or not. And what should happen with that data is not only that we're collecting it, but that we're trending it. And this is where when we start thinking about doing even some of these things on like a monthly basis, it's going to take a while to be able to develop a trend if we're only getting a result once a month. So it kind of propels us to think about, do we push forward with a little bit more frequent monitoring, because that way we can start to see those trends develop in a much shorter period of time. And when we're talking about trending, we're talking about graphing the data. It's one thing to have a table full of numbers, and if they're all going in one direction, yeah, you can see that. But over time, you're going to have some ups and downs, most likely, in those numbers. And so if we take those and look at them in a graph, then I think that it just pops out to you. It's just more eye-catching to look at that and consider, are we going in the right direction, or are things starting to go in the wrong direction? Not just do we violate action limits or not, but what's the movement here? Are we progressing, or are we getting worse? And being able to respond to that and investigate and try to understand why maybe those changes are occurring if we are seeing this sort of precipitous change to something that we don't want to have.
Yeah. So could you share maybe a little bit about the types of trends that the sterile compounding facility should really be looking for? Because you mentioned about having some kind of a graph instead of just looking at a table and numbers, but what really are the trends that we're wanting to focus on?
Well, this goes back to our question about identifying our microbes. So we want to look, of course, where we're seeing more microbial hits. We want to be able to look and see what they are. As we mentioned before, if there's something that comes from skin, that's something probably fairly used to, but if it's something that might come from soil, then we have yet a different problem. Another thing that is really helpful that has been recommended is to create heat maps. So in addition to graphing, you can trend by using a heat map, especially if you have a fairly robust sampling process and maps, which I think Matt and Sunil can probably talk about their maps a little bit. But that can give you an idea, where you're seeing the trends and where. And then that gives you a better idea, like, is it in your anteroom? Okay, but if it's in your anteroom, but we're not seeing it inside the classified or the more classified spaces, et cetera. So I think those things can tell you, like, who needs to be trained, who doesn't need to be trained. Is there a loose ceiling tile somewhere? Do we have a flow issue happening in our clean room, right? Because maybe we're going to certify our clean room twice a year. We don't necessarily know if we have a leak in a HEPA filter, but that kind of trending can give us some clues potentially.
Yeah, the more data points you have, the more chance you have to catch things. And a visual representation, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It's a lot easier to see something when it's on a chart. Sampling locations matter a lot too. Bacteria can exist next to each other. You can sample a location that comes up with no growth, and then, an 1/8 of an inch away, there's growth. So the locations really matter, the frequency matters. And also making sure that we're watching the trends. So even if you don't exceed action limits, if you're trending up, you need to start thinking about what is happening. If it's a personnel issue, if it's a cleaning issue, if it's a airflow issue, before you exceed the action limits, because the entire point of all of this is to keep control of our space so we produce sterile products for our patients.
I'm going to stay on the trending path here for one more question, and we'll move on to something else. So how is the trended data used to determine valuable alert and action levels? Because some organizations are doing above and beyond the levels that we see in USP 797.
Well, say you're sampling your PEC and you usually get 1 or 2 CFUs for growth, and then all of a sudden you get 2. Ensure it's not exceeded the action limit of your PEC, but it's out of the ordinary for you. So you can use that information to decide how to move forward, i.e. retest that PEC every day for 4 more days. And if you have that less than 1 or 2 growth that you normally have, then that was just kind of a out of the blue sort of thing. It's not a trend that you have to watch out for. But if you continue to get increased growth, even if it doesn't exceed that limit, it's something that we need to think about in our trends to create a plan to remediate any sort of bacteria that's growing in our classified space.
I think also conversely on that point, if you find an issue in your clean room, so say you have your certification team out and they find an issue, a flow issue or a leak or something of that nature, you can go back and look at that trended data to see if you've had any issues in those areas that might have potentially impacted a product that you've made in the past. And that data can be helpful in terms of like completing your investigation, deciding how to disposition something, et cetera.
Okay. So one of the things that some organizations will go on to do is then, and I know this is especially true in more of the GMP 503B world, is that you'll look at your trended data over the course of a year and possibly reevaluate your action levels. Is that something that we should be looking at from a 503A standpoint? And what are your thoughts on trending data to reevaluate the action levels?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you have what USP has sort of set as the minimum standard for these things, but I think to the point Tennille was making, that if you have sort of your baseline and kind of what is your expected performance of your facility, and it's much lower than any of the limits that have been offered by USP, anytime you start to go out beyond what you expect is your baseline is something that should be drawn attention to at that point, to me, because you're experiencing a change and we need to understand why that's happening. It's not to say that it's detrimental, but why is it occurring? Or is there a change that needs to be implemented? Maybe somebody's changed a process, or we've got new people that are gowning different. Who knows? It could be a lot of things. But nonetheless, I think if we understand what the baseline of performance is for our facility and for the number of people that are operating in there, then changes that start to exceed sort of that baseline level are something that we should take note of and take a look at.
Okay. So again, we're going to kind of switch things up a little bit, and let's move on to talking about sample locations, because this usually is like the one thing everybody really wants to get into because they don't know where the best places are to sample. So how does a sterile compounding pharmacy choose the best locations, and kind of why is it important that once you come up with those locations that you stick with those and kind of keep it consistent?
Well, there's different locations that you would pick if you're doing air sampling or surface sampling. So I guess it depends on which one we're talking about. If we're talking about air sampling, it's important to take a sample inside each one of the PECs. If you have really long PECs, you should take a sample every 4 feet. And then outside of the PEC in the ISO 7 room, you want to take samples where airflow is likely to be interrupted, like next to doors and pass-throughs. And similarly in the ISO 8 area, in the corners, around doors, entryways, those are the places where it's really important, because we want to make sure that the air that is in those areas isn't turbulent, isn't being disturbed by the pass-through or the door. Surface sampling is a little bit different. Do one of you guys want to talk about that?
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, I think surface sampling, we do want to be consistent, but we're thinking about places where touch contamination is going to occur. So certainly, we're going to definitely do that in the PEC for sure. It's going to be our sort of sacred place. We're going to make sure that we direct a lot of our monitoring efforts there. But from there, it depends on what our operation looks like and how we move about the facility, and what our procedures are like, and what our workflow is like. And taking a look at that, and those places where touch contamination can occur, where we're going to sit things down, are other places that I want to include in those surface samples. And certainly around places like the sink where hand washing occurs. Anytime we think about water, we're thinking about microbial growth potential. And so that's going to definitely be a place that's going to be of concern and interest to me.
I think also you want to make sure to tell a story. So both with your air and your surface sampling, you want to be able to like sort of see the flow of what's happening in your room, and make sure that you're sampling in all of the places that are critical. And of course, under dynamic conditions, you want to make sure that you're seeing like how things are really settling out, carts that are handled, computer keyboards, of course, surface areas where prep might occur, et cetera. But you're really wanting to select your samples so it shows like the movement of people within the environment and out, so that if you do start to see trends, those places can spark up for you.
Yep. I think the story portion is definitely important, because it really will help kind of track where things go and move through the space. And I think, Matt, did you have something maybe that you had wanted to share about like your experience with sort of like the locations and how that kind of gave you a clue as to what was really going on from a contamination standpoint?
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a pharmacy that found through samples, they actually followed a trail from their powder containment hood all the way over to their pass through. And so they had to refine their procedures about how they got out of that powder containment hood and didn't take any of that non-sterile material out of there and have a different process to get out of that hood so they didn't take that contamination with them. But yeah, they were able to tell an unfortunate story, but at least they were doing the monitoring to figure that out and understand that and make changes.
And that's interesting because it really makes or drives sort of the point home of using the environmental monitoring as like, again, not only you're doing it because it's required, but sort of as a tool. It's that tool that helps you learn about the environment more than you could ever want to know if you can use it kind of in the right way. So how about one of the other things that is a big topic of discussion is fungal media and using that in conjunction with the tryptic soy agar that gets mentioned in the chapter. So can you all share your thoughts on the use of fungal media for the sterile compounding pharmacy?
Well, from
So
my
I have a
understanding,
question.
oh, go ahead, Ken.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I would say, from my understanding, fungal media is no longer required. You just have to have 2 separate samples, and the incubation requirements are different. So the TSA plates are appropriate to grow both bacteria and fungi as long as they're treated so that they, the sporicides that might be left on our counters don't block the action of any potential growth. And so the incubation period has changed slightly, the recommendations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I think in a GMP environment, obviously we are required to do growth promotion on plates. So when you do that, the TSA plates are appropriate as long as you're challenging them appropriately and you can recover enough things. We don't see any problem with just using them and having the 2 cycles for incubation or the 2 temperature cycles for incubation. And forgive me, but the fungal plates that were mentioned in the previous or the current chapter, were those required or was it suggested? I feel like it was a suggestion.
Yeah, well, it was kind of interesting the way the chapter was written that way because they were, it was indicated that you needed to use a media suitable for fungal recovery if you were doing high risk compounding and it was only for the viable air. So it really like narrowed down who needed to be using the 2 types of media. My experience was a lot of organizations just picked it up, started doing both, and even if they were not doing high risk compounding. So we kind of saw, both sides of that, which was kind of interesting. So Matt, do you have any thoughts on the fungal media?
I think the only other time that it might be valuable is if you've had fungal growth and you want to do further investigation and increase sampling for fungal growth. that might be the time that you wanted to bring it in. I don't think it's really your daily driver, if you will, but I think it can come in those unique cases if you are having an issue with fungal growth and trying to sort it out.
Yeah.
I would agree with Matt.
And from the standpoint of doing your own sampling, if that's how you go about doing things, if you choose to use it, now you have two different plates that you're using at one location, so it doubles your number of samples per sampling session if you go that route. So totally up to you. I think one of the benefits that some organizations will say is that, well, you have faster turnaround time. You'll get results a little bit quicker than if you do a one plate and transfer it, but definitely up to the organization, right, on how they want to handle that situation. All right. I did mention here about the pharmacies doing their own sampling. So for all of you which have some experience with doing sampling, are there some tips maybe that you can share with those that are looking to take on doing their own viable air sampling, maybe viable surface sampling, especially because the frequency of that is looking to increase for them?
I bought a viable air sampler, but I haven't started doing it in-house yet. We still have an independent company come do our viable air sampling at my pharmacy, but we did increase our surface sampling frequency to weekly. So we do surface samples in all of our rooms every week. The nice thing about doing this in-house testing and the increased environmental monitoring requirements in the new 797 that's proposed is that those monitoring requirements are things that pharmacies can do in-house. So plates are not that expensive. It's not that time consuming to monitor their growth, and it's a really good way to make sure that you have control of your clean room in a way that's affordable for pharmacies to actually do, to carry out. A viable air sampler is a one-time expense, and plates are, very inexpensive for pharmacies to buy.
So Tennille, I'm gonna just, oh, go ahead, Kim.
I wanted to ask the group just their thoughts on augmenting with settle plates. I know USP doesn't specifically love them, but I feel like they're not a bad tool. And when you're sort of in the middle of your decision to either hire a company to come in more often or buy your own sampler, how do you feel about using them as an augmented option? Because in my current practice, we have viable air sampling that occurs constantly. Not that everybody's going to do that, but then, well, during the production process, but we also use a settle plate in addition.
I think settling plates have kind of gotten pushed out, and I think it's unfortunate that I think they do have a role. I think we have to sit back and think about a little bit the difference in what we're getting as far as the information from a settling plate versus the air sampling, right? The viable air sampling is pulling in this 1,000 liters of air, right? And so it's telling us how much potential contamination might exist in the air based on whatever actually lands on the plate, which is a whole nother story for another time about how those things work, right? There's some variation in viable air sampler performance, but that's another discussion for when we all really want to nerd out. But
yep.
the settling plates, on the other hand, are not looking at what's in the air and what could happen. They're looking at what's actually landing on the surface over that period of time, which typically you can use a settling plate for about 4 hours at a pop before they start to dry out. And so I think we get a really different piece of information and some idea of the risk of what's making it down to our work surface in a PEC if we're willing to implement a settling plate. Now, it's not any part of a regulatory requirement, but I do think can be valuable. I've noticed that in some recent revisions to Annex 1, they've kind of taken up a little bit more mention of settling plates. FDA's older aseptic processing document mentions them exactly in the way I think that you're describing, this sort of augmenting the program. But yeah, I think the answer that USP gave the last time that they answered comments was that, well, we're doing viable air sampling. We don't need settling plates, more or less. But I think it's really something that people could think about as a next step, especially in thinking about their PEC, right? That's where we would love to have more and different types of information, because that's the closest place. That's where we're really doing the work with the sterile preparation. So I think there's really a case to be made for putting them into practice.
So would you say that maybe, and I guess maybe what I'm thinking and asking here is, would that depend on the type of compounding occurring? So based on risk level, would you have different feelings on different risk levels, or, just implementing it across the board? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that in this case, it probably makes the most sense if we think about USP's new definitions of compounding rather than low, medium, and high risk.
Yep.
I think it makes more sense to think about it in a category 1 versus category 2 or 3 product, because the whole purpose of settling plates is to have another tool to show us that there's not bacteria in our PEC, and bacteria don't grow in our compounded product immediately. That's why the category 1 CSPs have such short expiration dates, because they're less likely to have bacterial growth in that short amount of time. But if we're going to have an extended beyond use date, then I definitely think settling plates would be more useful in that instance than in immediate use or category 1 CSPs.
Anybody have any other thoughts on that?
I think you could make a case in all for all of them, but particularly the second, the category 2, because it's like a very tiny additional thing, and it would give you an additional piece of data that would be very, very easy to have. And like Matt was saying, it's giving you an idea of what's happening close to your work surface, which is pretty imperative. So I think you could make a case for all, but particularly 2 and 3.
Okay. Still kind of staying along the lines of, if you're doing the sampling kind of yourself, is this something that you have maybe multiple people trained within your organization? Is it 1 or 2? I know all of you kind of work not necessarily in a hospital setting or a health system where there'll be a number of hospitals within that system, but maybe how would you go about training individuals that might be doing the sampling for you in-house? Because Tennille, you're, I guess, in the process of that. How have you gone about working towards the training?
I think it's important to have multiple people trained to do sampling. If you have the same person that's always responsible for cleaning and or sampling, sometimes that person can cut some corners or get lazy. And I don't want that to happen. And, as a pharmacist that's supervising technicians, we're not looking over their shoulder all day, every day. So I think mixing up the person who's trained to do at least surface sampling in my pharmacy, so they have a map, so they're always doing the same locations, but I think switching the people is important, at least for me. I don't know about the rest of you guys.
I think it scales based on your operation. We may be talking to some people that have one person that is the only person that works in their clean room environment, right, in the 503A pharmacy. And I'm sure we're having other people in the audience that have, large, diverse staff of people that are going to be operating in there. So I think this is going to scale with the size and scope of the operation. Abby, you mentioned the health systems. I mean, they're going to have immense staffs by comparison. And so, I think they're going to, just by the vast nature of the number of people working there, they're going to have a much wider array of folks that are capable across multiple shifts, day and night.
And probably the other thing to add to that is just to make sure that the staff that are doing the sampling are properly trained and understand how the plates work and understand what they're doing, and have a little bit more a deeper dive into what happens when you're changing the plate or touching the plate, et cetera, so that contamination doesn't occur.
They're all really great, points on that from a training standpoint. We talked a little bit about the air samplers. Any tips on like choosing contact plates or media or anything in your experience that you could share with the listeners?
I think one thing that's out there now, you can get plates that are stored at room temperature. Some are stored under refrigeration. I think life is just much easier if you have plates that you can store at room temperature, and we're not fighting shorter dating and things on some of
Mhm.
those plates. So I think that's one thing to look for. I think beyond that, we're going to be looking for that growth promotion data that comes with those plates as well to make sure that we have that documentation on file. Certainly, there's going to be some regulators and inspectors want to know if you've been paying attention and kept up with all that good paperwork and documentation. So I'd look to file that away as well.
Yeah, and just
They will.
another thing that I'd like to add is just to do positive controls in-house as well. So make sure you contaminate plates, because you want to make sure that the plates that you've gotten, say they come refrigerated, that they are actually still able, once you get them, to promote bacterial growth. So contaminating plates as a positive in-house control is something that I think is important too.
It's incredibly important. You have to, like Matt was saying, you need to have that data that comes with it, but also doing your own controls is, you will be asked. So that's incredibly important.
And then thoughts on that from kind of a doing growth promotion in-house. So having, I worked in a contract lab. So when we would do growth promotion, obviously we have calibrated cultures. We're inoculating with less than 100 CFU. We're basically mimicking the manufacturer's, growth promotion. So thoughts on either sending a stack of plates to a lab for growth promotion versus just doing some kind of gross contamination on a plate as a control. And I think maybe Kim, you could speak to some of this with what you go through in your 503B world.
So where I currently am, they do their own inoculations, which are fine as long as you can control that, know what you're doing. Maybe Tennille can tell us how she's doing it in her pharmacy, but also sending them out might be an easier, less risky option for some people, because then you can send it and they'll control the situation. But it's important, and I think that we will see the agency look more for that as we see 483s going forward. But maybe Tennille can talk about how she does it, because I've seen it done both ways, and I think it can just be easier for some if you don't feel comfortable controlling the inoculation.
Yeah, we've just done gross contamination here at my pharmacy, but I can see the benefit of sending it out, at least on occasion, even if you don't do it for every single surface sample time or every single batch of plates. But I think that doing it on occasion would definitely be something that would be useful. But at my pharmacy, we just gross contaminate the plates. It reminds me of microbiology lab in college.
So I think that's a good point, Tennille, because you're doing it as are you doing it as a control with each sampling session as opposed to just receiving a lot of media for use?
Yeah, so we do
Okay.
surface sampling once a week. So I just contaminate one plate and make sure it's from that same lot. So each sampling session, I do a positive control to make sure that, if I very rarely get growth in my clean room, so it makes me nervous if I have weeks and weeks and weeks with 0 CFUs. So I want to make sure that I'm actually able to recover growth. So I need that positive control to show that my plates are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. And that would be a great option. And I think the other thing that Kim was mentioning about sending out would be, you get a new lot in, you want to kind of check it before you even use it. I've seen some organizations which will hold on to a bag of plates until the very end, right before they expire, and then they'll send those out to kind of make sure that they still would have supported growth throughout the whole thing. So it's really interesting to see, Kim, what you do in your world with the 503B and how it relates to what Tennille does on her basis, kind of based on what your availability is within your organization to make that happen. So Matt, do you have anything that you want to share from a media growth promotion standpoint?
Yeah, I guess the thought of a lot of pharmacies going and handling all this bacteria and plating all this stuff, I'm having some mild palpitations over here. So I don't know that that's for everybody. So I think if people want that, they're either looking at relying on the data they're receiving from their supplier, manufacturer, maybe they want to do some studies on some sort of frequency to validate their vendors in some way, but I'm not too keen on a bunch of pharmacies opening up all this bacteria. I don't know that that goes in a really positive direction.
Right.
I would agree. You have to have somebody that understands what they're doing with that if they're going to like do the specific inoculation. And that's where if that's what you want, you really want to look and see if you're going to recover X things, then sending them to a lab where they can do that, and then you get that same information back, like you were saying, Abby, how you were doing it.
Yep.
Then that definitely is a good option to send it out. Probably the better one, unless you have a microbiologist.
Yeah, you have a microbiologist and you got a nice little lab set up to do that within your organization. So, all right. So did want to talk a little bit about the incubation differences that we see, and we kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but can you guys break down how 797 incubation from 2008 really does differ now from what we're seeing in the 2019 version?
Yeah, so the 2008 version required the samples to be incubated at 30 to 35 degrees for 72 hours for TSA, and then 26 to 30 for 5 to 7 days for malt agar extract. And then the new proposed one is for TSAs to be incubated at 30 to 35 degrees for no less than 48 hours, followed by 20 to 25 degrees for no less than 5 days, which is adequate for both bacterial and fungal growth.
Yep.
And in addition, that's very consistent with the 503B guidance, CFR guidance as well.
I think the one thing that stood out to me, and a little bit outside this, but in thinking about media fills, is looking at the process for incubation for those, because the media fills are the one thing where the incubation takes place at the lower temperature first in the proposed 797. And this is at odds with 1116 that says you should do the higher temperature first. So that's, I've had some other microbiologists say to me that it's debatable, I don't know, but it's just been really curious to me that this exists in 797 is at odds with the statement in another chapter. So seems like something's got to give one way or the other.
I can help you on that one. So I'll just so having participated in that writing, it was a really interesting discussion because we had a couple FDA microbiologists in with the committee too, and the media fill incubation fell in line with the FDA's aseptic processing guidance, which says if you're doing the 2 temperatures, do the 20 to 25 first and then go to the 30 to 35. So to kind of keep things cool with what USP wanted to do versus what the FDA was already saying, that was kind of the route that we went. And then looking at the incubation for the media for EM, it was like you said, Matt, it's the opposite. It was following what 1116 says about starting with the warmer temperature to get all those skin organisms. So it's kind of like you sort of have conflicting information in an informational USP chapter versus what the FDA is saying. So that's sort of where it landed. And probably, Kim, you can agree to this too. You ask any microbiologist out there about temperature and what should go first and what should go second, and you will get into a ridiculously long conversation because there's always an opinion, right, Kim? Yeah. So as far as the incubations go, so Tennille, with your organization, and I'm guessing you're incubating items yourself, is that correct? So how are you handling that? Do you have 2 incubators in place for everything?
I think I have 3 incubators. So because we incubate a lot of samples. But yeah, I think I have 2 on the non-hazardous side and 1 on the hazardous side. So I have 2 complete separate clean room suites because my pharmacy kind of expanded as we grew. So they're not close together. So I have to have lots of separate, supplies, obviously.
Totally understandable for that.
Yeah, and we just use a I'm not sure if I'm allowed to use any brand names. We use a computer program to track all of our data. So we have a person that, checks the samples daily and then records any growth in a computer system so we can track that.
That is great. Does anybody have any additional thoughts on incubation or maintaining incubators or anything like that? Because that's also something now that I think a lot more organizations, if they didn't have incubators previously, they're kind of looking to do some things themselves just because it makes sense now with the more frequent requirements.
My only advice is to get them calibrated. Because if you have an inspection that comes in, they're going to want to see your calibration reports of all of your things, including your incubators.
Yep. All right. I think we ended up having a really great discussion today and covered a lot of different things. Is there anything else that any of you on the panel would like to bring up, touch on as it relates to environmental monitoring and the viable air and surface sampling that the pharmacies are doing?
Yeah, we've touched on 1116 and the fact that it exists and some different parameters in it, but I don't think we spent some time talking about the chart in 1116 that looked at the rate of contamination that you find in your environmental monitoring. And I think that's really a different discussion, a different way of thinking about it than what 797 has introduced. And so I think that we should talk about that just a little to make sure to refer people to that chart. And as people are increasing their frequency of environmental monitoring with looking at just how often they get any growth, it's not about did I violate any limits or anything, it's just did I get growth, yes or no, and how often did I get it, then that starts to give you a new standard to try to shoot for using those rates of contamination in 1116.
Okay.
So I would probably throw out one additional thing. This is a lot of information contained in these chapters, and doing this type of monitoring requires a deeper understanding than you're just going to get from reading these chapters. So there are resources out there. PDA is a great one. If you're finding, wow, this is like so overwhelming, where do I begin? How can I do this adequately? Seek them. One little secret is that FDA has the Center of Excellence that is really a tool that they've created for 503Bs. But there's a lot of information in there that's available for the public. And there are some live trainings that you can take on environmental monitoring that are really designed for 503Bs, but if they have space open, they will let anybody take them. So that's the secret. And that's free. So that's something to look out for. And then I know Abby's company has a lot of really great information. We won't say who they are, but those things are incredibly important and helpful. And so I know that previously we've really gone to our drug suppliers to get this kind of information, but there's greater, more specific, larger information out there that I would encourage everybody to look for, and it's not that difficult to find.
I'd just like to, I guess, reiterate that environmental monitoring isn't about just checking boxes to make sure that you get the things done. It's actually about an active, thoughtful process to make sure that you are evaluating the data that you're given to make sure that you are able to create sterile products. Looking at those trends, not just getting the company to come in every 6 months and filing the report away. You actually need to look at these things and look at them with a critical eye to determine what might need to be done to improve your processes.
Yeah, I think to that end that all this environmental monitoring, at first it might sound more overwhelming, but as everybody's highlighted, we're talking about plates that are relatively cheap, a couple bucks for a plate. I know in pharmacy it's always just one more thing to add to the plate, but if you're willing to make the commitment to this environmental monitoring and make it part of the sort of daily or weekly routine or whatever it is you're going to do from a frequency standpoint, it gets pretty mundane, pretty routine, and just sort of a thing you do as a part of your day-to-day operations. And so you can do it, I promise you. And it's just making that decision to push forward.
Okay. Yeah, this was a really great discussion today, and would just want to reiterate again that all of this is very doable. Sometimes there's that learning curve, and Kim gave some great resources. Definitely take the time to learn more about what's going on. There's so much information out there available to kind of educate, and you know, network with some other people that have experience. If you have others in the pharmacy world that you're friends with that have done this, reach out and see what they're doing to implement it within their own organization. So definitely thank you, Kim, for bringing your 503B experience to this, because it does give us some insight on what those 503 organizations can do to do more than the chapter minimum. So really great information shared. Thank you very much. And Matt, lots of great information from your experience, and sharing a lot as far as other resources that are out there. And Tennille, you're right there in the mix of things, right? Trying to implement sampling within your own 503A organization, and you know, getting there and getting it done. And that's, I think, really important for everybody listening here to understand, like, hey, you can do this, you can do it more frequently. There are a number of organizations out there doing that. Tennille's is a great example of that. And pretty soon, hopefully she'll be up and running with that air sampler too. So thank you everybody for joining us today. We appreciate it. And hopefully we'll maybe see some of you around the industry again soon.